Chapter 4. The committee met that very afternoon, and the next morning, and the next afternoon, and the scheme quickly took shape. Robert, rolling in golden billows of Romanian oil, was called in as financial advisor, and after calculation, the scheme strongly recommended itself to him. All the summer the town was thronged with visitors, and inquiring American minds would hardly leave unvisited the museum at so Elizabethan a place. "I don't know what you'll have in your museum," he said, "but I expect they'll go to look, and even if they don't find much, they'll have paid their shillings. And if Mrs. Boucher thinks her husband will let you have that big tithe barn of his at a small rent, I dare say you'll have a paying proposition." The question of funds, therefore, in order to convert the tithe barn into a museum, was instantly gone into. Robert professed himself perfectly ready to equip the tithe barn with all necessary furniture and decoration, if he might collar the whole of the receipts. But his willingness to take all financial responsibilities made the committee think that they would like to have a share in them, since so shrewd a businessman clearly saw the probability of making something out of it. Up till then, the sordid question of money had not really occurred to them. There was to be a museum, which would make them busy again, and the committee was to run it. They were quite willing to devote practically the whole of their time to it, for Risholme was one of those happy places where the proverb that time is money was a flat fallacy, for nobody had ever earned a penny with it. But since Robert's financial judgment argued that the museum would be a profitable investment, the committee naturally wished to have a hand in it, and the 3 members each subscribed £50 and co-opted Robert to join the board and supply the rest. Profits, if any, would be divided up between the members of the committee in proportion to their subscriptions. The financial Robert would see to all that, and the rest of them could turn their attention to the provision of curiosities. There was evidently to be no lack of them, for everyone in Risholme had stores of miscellaneous antiquities and specimens of various kinds which encumbered their houses and required a deal of dusting, but which couldn't quite be thrown away. A very few striking objects were only lent. Among these were Daisy's box of coins and Mrs. Antropus's fibula, but the most of them, like Georgie's glass and Colonel Boucher's pieces of Samian ware, were fervently bestowed. Objects of all sorts poured in. The greater portion of a spinning wheel, an Elizabethan pestle and mortar, no end of Roman tiles, a large wooden post unhesitantly called a whipping post, some indecipherable documents on parchment with seals attached, belonging to the vicar, an ordnance map of the district, numerous collections of fossils and of carved stones from the site of the abbey, ancient quilts, a baby's cradle, worm-eaten enough to be Anglo-Saxon, queer-shaped bottles, a tigerware jug, fire irons too ponderous for use, and, by special vote of the parish council, the stocks which had hitherto stood at the edge of the pond on the green. All Risholme was busy again, for fossils had to be sorted out. It was early realized that even a museum could have too many ammonites. Curtains had to be stitched for the windows, labels to be written, Samian ware to be pieced together, cases arranged, a catalogue prepared. The period of flatness consequent on Lucia's desertion had passed off, and what had certainly added zest to industry was the thought that Lucia had nothing to do with the museum. When next she designed to visit her discarded kingdom, she would find how busily and successfully and originally they had got on without her, and that there was no place for her on the committee, and probably none in the museum for the Elizabethan turnspit, which so often made the chimney of her music-room to smoke. Risholme, indeed, was busier than ever, for not only had it the museum feverishly to occupy it, so that it might be open for the tourist season this year, and, if possible, before Lucia came down for one of her promised weekends, but it was immersed in a wave of Psychical experiments. Daisy Quantock had been perfectly honest in acknowledging that the idea of the museum was not hers at all, but Abfu's, her Egyptian guide. She had, it is true, been as ingenious as Joseph in interpreting Abfu's directions, but it was Abfu to whom all credit was due, and who evidently took such a deep interest in the affairs of Risholm. She even offered to present the museum with the sheet of foolscap on which the words Risholm Museum, not mouse, were written. But the general feeling of the committee, while thanking her for her munificence, was that it would not be tactful to display it, since the same Sibylline sheet contained those sarcastic remarks about Lucia. It was proved also that Abfu had meant the museum to be started, for subsequently he several times said, "Much pleased with your plans for the museum. Abfu approves." So everybody else wanted to get into touch with Abfu too, and no less than 4 planchettes or Ouija boards were immediately ordered by various members of Risholm society. At present, Abfu did not manifest himself to any of them, except in what was possibly Arabic script, for it certainly bore a strong resemblance to his earlier efforts of communication with Daisy. And while she encouraged the scribes to persevere in the hope that he might soon regale them with English, she was not really very anxious that he should. With her he was getting Englisher and Englisher every day, and had not Simpkinson, after having had the true meaning of the word lazy carefully explained to him, consented to manage her garden again, it certainly would have degenerated into primeval jungle, for she absolutely had not a minute to attend to it. Simpkinson, however, was quite genial. "Oh, yes, ma'am, very pleased to come back," he said. "I knew you would be able to get on long without me, and I want no explanations. Now, let's have a look round and see what you've been doing. Why, whatever's happened to my mulberry tree?" That was Simpkinson's way. He always talked of my flowers and my asparagus when he meant hers. "I've been pruning its roots," she said. "Well, ma'am, you've done your best to do it in," said Simpkinson. "I don't think it's dead, though. I dare say it'll pull round." Abfu had been understood to say it was dead, but perhaps he meant something else, thought Daisy, and they went on to the small circular bed below the dining-room windows. "Phlox," she said hopefully. "Broccoli," said Simpkinson, examining the young green sprouts. "And the long bed there. I sowed a lot of annuals there, and I don't see a sign of anything coming up." He fixed her with a merry eye. "I believe you've been weeding, ma'am," he said. "I shall have to get you a lot of young plants if you want a bit of color there. It's too late for me to put my seeds in again." Daisy rather wished she hadn't come out with him, and changed the subject to something more cheerful. "Well, I shan't want the rockery," she said. "You needn't bother about that. All these stones will be carted away in a day or 2. "Glad of that, ma'am. I'll be able to get to my potting shed again. Well, I'll try to put you to rights. I'd best pull up the broccoli first. You won't want it under your windows, will you? You stick to rolling the lawn, ma'am, if you want to garden. You won't do any harm then." It was rather dreadful being put in one's place like this, but Daisy did not dare risk a second quarrel, and the sight of Georgie at the dining-room window, he had come to Ouija, as the psychical processes, whether Ouija or planchette were now called, was rather a relief. Weeding, after all, was unimportant compared with Ouijing. "And I don't believe I ever told you what Olga wrote about," said Georgie, as soon as she was within range. "We've talked of nothing but museum. Oh, and Mrs. Boucher's planchette has come, but it broke in the post and she's gumming it together." "I doubt if it will act," said Daisy. "But what did Olga say? It quite went out of my head to ask you." "It's too heavenly of her," said he. "She's asked me to go up and stay with her for the first night of the opera. She's singing Lucrezia, and has got a stall for me." "No," said Daisy, making a trial trip over the blotting paper to see if the pencil was sharp. "That will be an event. I suppose you're going?" "Just about," said Georgie. It's going to be broadcasted too, and I shall be listening to the original." "How interesting," said Daisy. "And there you'll be in Brompton Square, just opposite Lucia." "Oh, you heard from her? What did she say?" "Apparently she's getting on marvelously," said Georgie. "Not a moment to spare, just what she likes." Daisy pushed the planchette aside. There would be time for that when she had had a little talk about Lucia. "And are you going to stay with her, too?" she asked. Georgie was quite determined not to be ill-natured. He had taken no part, or very little, in this trampling on Lucia's majesty, which had been so merrily going on. "I should love to, if she would ask me," he observed. "She only says she's going to. Of course, I shall go to see her." "I wouldn't," said Daisy savagely. "If she asked me 50 times, I should say no, 50 times. What's happened is that she's dropped us. I wouldn't have her on her museum committee if she gave her pearls to it and said they belonged to Queen Elizabeth. I wonder you haven't got more spirit." "I've got plenty of spirit," said Georgie, "and I allow I did feel rather hurt at her letter, but then after all, what does it matter?" "Of course it doesn't, if you're going to stay with Olga," said Daisy. "How she'll hate you for that." "Well, I can't help it," he said. "Lucia hasn't asked me, and Olga has. She's twice reminded Olga that she may use her music room to practice in whenever she likes. Isn't that kind? She would love to be able to say that Olga's always practicing in her music room. But aren't we ill-natured? Let's weege instead." Georgie found, when he arrived next afternoon in Brompton Square, that Olga had already had her early dinner, and that he was to dine alone at 7 and follow her to the opera house. "I'm on the point of collapse from sheer nerves," she said. "I always am before I sing, and then out of desperation I pull myself together. If I survive till midnight, we're going to have a little party here. Cortese is coming, and Princess Isabel, and 1 or 2 other people. Georgie, it's very daring of you to come here, you know, because my husband's away, and I'm an unprotected female alone with Don Juan. How's Risholm? Talk to me about Risholm. Are you engaged to Piggy yet? And is it broccoli or phlox in Daisy's round bed? Your letter was so mysterious, too. I know nothing about the museum yet." "What museum? Are you going to kill and stuff Lucia and put her in the hall? You simply alluded to the museum as if I knew all about it." "If you don't talk to me, I shall scream." Georgie flung himself into the task, delighted to be thought capable of doing anything for Olga. He described at great length and with much emphasis the whole of the history of Risholm, from the first epiphany of Arabic and Abfu on the planchette board, down to the return of Simpkinson. Olga lost herself in these chronicles, and when her maid came in to tell her it was time to start, she got up quite cheerfully. "And so it was broccoli," she said. "I was afraid it was going to be phlox after all. You're an angel, Georgie, for getting me through my bad hour. I'll give you anything you like for the museum. Wait for me afterwards at the stage door. We'll drive back together." From the moment Olga appeared, the success of the opera was secure. Cortese, who was conducting, had made his music well. It thoroughly suited her, and she was singing and looking and acting her best. Again and again, after the first act, the curtain had to go up, and not until the house was satisfied could Georgie turn his glances this way and that to observe the audience. Then, in the twilight of a small box on the second tier, he espied a woman who was kissing her hand somewhere in his direction, and a man waving a program, and then he suddenly focused them and saw who they were. He ran upstairs to visit them, and there was Lucia in an extraordinarily short skirt, with her hair shingled, and round her neck 3 short rows of seed pearls. "Giorgino mio," she cried, "this is a surprise. You came up to see our dear Olga's triumph. I do call that loyalty. Why did you not tell me you were coming?" "I thought I would call tomorrow," said Georgie, with his eyes still going backwards and forwards between the shingle and the pearls and the legs. "Ah, you are staying the night in town?" she asked. "Not going back by the midnight train? The dear old midnight train, and waking in Risholme at your club?" "No, I'm staying with Olga," said Georgie. Lucia seemed to become slightly cataleptic for a moment, but recovered. "No, are you really?" she said. "I think that is unkind of you, Georgie. You might have told me you were coming." "But you said the house wasn't ready," said he, "and she asked me." Lucia put on a bright smile. "Well, you're forgiven," she said. "We're all at 6 and 7s yet. And we've seen nothing of dearest Olga, or Mrs. Shuttleworth, I should say, for that's on the bills. Of course we'll drive you home, and you must come in for a chat before Mrs. Shuttleworth gets home. And then no doubt she will be very tired and want to go to bed." Lucia, as she spoke, had been surveying the house with occasional little smiles and wagglings of her hand in vague directions. "Ah, there's Elsie Garraby Ashton," she said. "And who is that with her, Peppino? Lord Shrivenham, surely. So come back with me and have ickle talk, Georgie. Oh, there's the Italian ambassadress. Dearest Gioconda, such a sweet. And look at the royal box. What a gathering. That's the royal box, Georgie, away to the left, that large one in the tier below. Too near the stage for my taste, so little illusion." Lucia suddenly rose and made a profound curtsy. "I think she saw us, Peppino," she said. "Perhaps you had better bow. No, she's looking somewhere else now. You did not bow quick enough. And what a party in dearest Aggie's box. Who can that be? Oh, yes, it's Toby Limsfield. We met him at Aggie's. Do you remember, on the first night we were up? So join us at the grand entrance, Georgie, and drive back with us. We shall be giving a lift to somebody else, I'll be bound, but if you have your motor, it is so ill-natured not to pick up friends. I always do it. They will be calling us the Lifts of London, as Marcia Whitby said." "I'm afraid I can't do that," said Georgie. "I'm waiting for Olga, and she's having a little party, I believe." "No, is she really?" asked Lucia, with all the old Risholme vivacity. "Who is coming?" "Cortese, I believe," said Georgie, thinking it might be too much for Lucia if he mentioned a princess, and one or two of the singers. Lucia's mouth watered, and she swallowed rapidly. That was the kind of party she longed to be asked to, for it would be so wonderful and glorious to be able casually to allude to Olga's tiny, tiny little party after the first night of the opera. Not a party at all, really, just a few in-times, herself and Cortese and so on. How could she manage it, she wondered. Could she pretend not to know that there was a party, and just drop in for a moment in neighborly fashion, with enthusiastic congratulations? Or should she pretend her motor had not come, and hang about the stage door with Georgie? Peppino could go home in the motor, and get a lift. Or should she hint very violently to Georgie how she would like to come in just for a minute? Or should she, now that she knew there was to be a party, merely assert that she had been to it? Perhaps a hint to Georgie was the best plan. Her momentary indecision was put an end to by the appearance of Cortese, threading his way among the orchestra, and the lowering of the lights. Georgie, without giving her any further opportunity, hurried back to his stall, feeling that he had had an escape, for Lucia's beady eye had been fixing him, just in the way it always used to do when she wanted something, and, in consequence, meant to get it. He felt he had been quite wrong in ever supposing that Lucia had changed. She was just precisely the same, translated into her larger sphere. She had expanded. Strange though it seemed, she had only been in bud at Risholme. "I wonder what she'll do," thought Georgie, as he settled himself into his stall. "She wants dreadfully to come." The opera came to an end in a blaze of bouquets and triumph and recalls and curtsies. It was something of an occasion, for it was the first night of the opera and the first performance of Lucia in London, and it was late when Olga came florally out. The party, which was originally meant to be no party at all, but just a little supper with Cortese and one or two of the singers, had marvelously increased during the evening, for friends had sent round messages and congratulations, and Olga had asked them to drop in. And when she and Georgie arrived at Brompton Square, the whole of the curve at the top was packed with motors. "Heavens, what a lot of people I seem to have asked," she said. "But it will be great fun. There won't be nearly enough chairs, but we'll sit on the floor. And there won't be nearly enough supper, but I know there's a ham, and what can be better than a ham? Oh, Georgie, I am happy." Now from opposite, across the narrow space of the square, Lucia had seen the arrival of all these cars. In order to see them better, she had gone on to the balcony of her drawing-room and noted their occupants with her opera glasses. There was Lord Limpsfield and the Italian ambassadress, and Mr. Garraby Ashton, and Cortese, and some woman to whom Mr. Garraby Ashton bowed, and Mrs. Garraby Ashton curtsied. Up they streamed, and there was the Duchess of Whitby, Marcia, for Lucia had heard her called that, coming up the steps and curtsying too. But as yet Olga and Georgie quite certainly had not come. It seemed strange that so many brilliant guests should arrive before their hostess, but Lucia saw at once that this was the most chic informality that it was possible to conceive. No doubt Mr. Shuttleworth was there to receive them, but how wonderful it all was! And then the thought occurred to her that Olga would arrive, and with her would be Georgie, and she felt herself turning bright green all over with impotent jealousy. Georgie in that crowd! It was impossible that Georgie should be there, and not she. But that was certainly what would happen, unless she thought of something. Georgie would go back to Risholme and describe this gathering, and he would say that Lucia was not there. He supposed she had not been asked. Lucia thought of something. She hurried downstairs and let herself out. Motors were still arriving, but perhaps she was not too late. She took up her stand in the central shadow of a gas lamp, close to Olga's door, and waited. Up the square came yet another car, and she could see it was full of flowers. Olga stepped out, and she darted forward. "Oh, Mrs. Shuttleworth," she said, "splendid, glorious, marvelous! If only Beethoven was alive! I could not think of going to bed without just popping across to thank you for a revelation. Georgie, dear, just to shake your hand, that is all. All. I won't detain you. I see you have a party. You wonderful queen of song." Olga, at all times, was good-natured. Her eye met Georgie's for a moment. "Oh, but come in," she said. "Do come in. It isn't a party. It's just anybody. Georgie, be a dear and help to carry all those flowers in. How nice of you to come across, Mrs. Lucas. I know you'll excuse my running on ahead, because at least I hope all, my guests have come, and there's no one to look after them." Lucia, following closely in her wake and taking no further notice of Georgie, slipped into the little front drawing-room behind her. It was crammed, and it was such a little room. Why had she not foreseen this? Why had she not sent a note across to Olga earlier in the day, asking her to treat Lucia's house precisely as her own, and have her party in the spacious music-room? It would have been only neighborly. But the bitterness of such regrets soon vanished in the extraordinary sweetness of the present, and she was soon in conversation with Mrs. Garraby Ashton, and distributing little smiles and nods to all the folk with whom she had the slightest acquaintance.